They did not come to conquer. Conquest would have required them to think Earth was worth the fuel. What the Austral Compact actually did was mark humanity's solar system as a dumping ground, file the paperwork under minor sanitation, and leave behind a ship they considered too broken to be worth the trip home. The insult once translated was almost beautiful in its precision. The insult made concrete. The transmission arrived on a Tuesday in perfect, unaccented English, read by a face that smiled the way people smile at children who have drawn something ugly and called it a horse. By provision of the Austral Compact Waste Reclamation Accord, the diplomat said, the vessel designated Hollow Bell is hereby transferred to the jurisdiction of Sol 3. This transfer constitutes no treaty obligations, no protection guarantees, and no acknowledgement of technological parity. The vessel has been stripped of all functional systems in accordance with Disposal Protocol 9. We trust you will find some use for the shell. The diplomat's name was Vareth IV. He had a title that translated roughly as Assistant Undersecretary for the Management of Lesser Civilizations, and he delivered the entire message without once breaking his smile. The physical evidence arrived 3 days later, towed into high orbit by a drone that undocked and left without a word. Someone had painted the hull in wide orange stripes and stenciled beneath them in 6 alien scripts and 1 badly rendered line of English. An ON functional for disassembly only. The UN briefing room went quiet when the translation came through, not the quiet of shock, the quiet of people doing math about how angry they were allowed to be. Dr. Priya Akonquares was the only person in that room who wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the hull markings, specifically the stencil edges, where the orange paint had been applied over an older layer of something that wasn't paint at all. I want to board it, she said. Nobody answered her, so she said it again, slower, the way you say something you intend to still be true in an hour. Aye. The protagonist's reframe. Priya was 41, a materials weapons engineer who had spent 11 years arguing that Austral hull compounds could not possibly be as inert as everyone assumed, and 11 years being told, gently and then not gently, to stop wasting grant money on it. She kept a folder of every rejection email. She had stopped being angry about them around year 7. By year 9, it was just data. They didn't strip the ship, she said, to a room that had already decided the meeting was over. They stripped what they thought was dangerous. I'm interested in everything else. That was the whole speech. No rallying cry, no fist on the table, just a woman with a folder of rejection emails already walking toward the door. Aye. The discovery loop. The boarding party was small on purpose. Priya, plus 3 people who had each spent a career being wrong in the specific direction of turning out to be right. Dr. Femi Bonsu had published a paper 9 years earlier arguing that Austral hull lattices were not welded but grown, a claim the peer review process had described as thermodynamically illiterate. Dr. Alaric Voss Propulsion had lost a professorship over a model suggesting Austral drive cores used the ship's own hull as a resonance chamber. And Myril Tanaka, weapons targeting no relation to the singer, a fact she mentioned exactly once and then never again, had built her entire career on the unfashionable belief that Austral targeting arrays were designed to be found. They entered through what should have been a service airlock and wasn't. Bonsu stopped walking first. He put his palm flat against the interior bulkhead and didn't say anything for 11 seconds because his hand had told him something before his mouth caught up. This isn't hull plating, he said. It's still growing, slowly. The lattice is semi-crystalline at ambient temperature, but it's laying down new material along stress lines the way bone does. They didn't strip the hull because the hull isn't a system, it's the ship's immune response. You can't decommission an immune system, you can only stop feeding it. He sat down on the deck plating because his legs had stopped working correctly and asked someone to bring him a sample kit. Voss found the drive section 40 minutes later and went very quiet in a different way, the quiet of a man recalculating 9 years of his own career in real time. They pulled the reaction cores, he said. Of course they did. That's the part that looks like a weapon, but the cores were never the drive. The hull is the drive. The whole vessel is a resonance chamber and the cores were just the ignition source. He crouched by an empty housing the size of a dinner table. We could build a compatible ignition source, not their design. Ours, cruder. I think he stopped, did the arithmetic again, said it slower the second time. I think we could have this flying in under a year if we started today. He did not sit on the floor. He simply stopped being able to stand up straight and leaned against the housing instead and stayed there for a while. There's a problem, he added, once he'd found his voice again. Our ignition sources run hot. Theirs didn't need to because the resonance chamber was doing most of the work passively. If we force our crude cores into a housing this size, we're not looking at a controlled burn. We're looking at a chamber that wants to sing at a frequency our hardware can't survive for more than a few minutes at a time. He tapped the empty housing once, almost fondly. So we build something that only has to survive a few minutes. We're not trying to fly this ship to another star. We're trying to fly it far enough, fast enough once. Priya wrote that down without comment, because it was already the plan she hadn't said out loud yet. The sample kit results from Bonsu's hull came back an hour later and confirmed a detail he hadn't said aloud yet either. The growth wasn't uniform. It was denser along specific structural spars, thinner across open panels, laid down in exactly the pattern his rejected paper had predicted 9 years earlier and nobody had believed. The immune response he described that morning wasn't reacting to damage already taken. It was reinforcing a head of stress it hadn't experienced yet, the same load path logic he'd once been laughed out of a conference room for citing in Coral. He didn't say anything more about it. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood without being told twice that they were not standing inside a ship. They were standing inside something that was still, in its slow and patient way, thinking about them. Tanaka's discovery came last, and it was the quiet one, which was how everyone knew it mattered most. The weapons bay had been stripped down to bare struts, every rail, every emitter, every piece of hardware physically unbolted and removed. What remained was the targeting substrate, a lattice of receiver nodes built into the walls themselves, the part of the system that had never been hardware at all because it had never needed to be. They took the guns, Tanaka said. They left the part that aims them. She ran her scanner along a wall panel and watched the readout climb past anything she'd been trained to expect. This isn't a targeting computer, it's a targeting language. It doesn't care what weapon you bolt onto it. It cares that the weapon can be told where to point, and this thing will tell it in real time across the entire firing envelope, faster than any system we've built ourselves. She looked up. They didn't disarm this ship. They took the tools out of a fully wired house and called it empty. Each of them owned exactly one discovery, and each discovery made the last one heavier. IV. The ticking clock. It took the compact 11 weeks to notice. The formal communication, when it came, was written in the specific dialect of an empire that has been perfecting condescension for 3,000 years and has never once needed to raise its voice to do it. It has come to the attention of the compact that Sol 3 has undertaken unauthorized modification of a disposed asset, it read. This constitutes a Class 2 recovery violation. The vessel and any derivative technology must be surrendered within 48 hours, or the compact reserves the right to enforce recovery by appropriate means. There was no threat of invasion in it. There didn't need to be. The message assumed, correctly, that Earth understood what appropriate means, implied when it came from a civilization that measured its own restraint in centuries. Priya read it twice, in a lab that smelled like solder and cold coffee, surrounded by 3 people who had spent the last 11 weeks not sleeping properly. 48 hours, Voss said. Then we have 48 hours, Priya said and went back to her console. Not fear, acceleration v the asymmetric battle. The compact sent one ship. One was, apparently, all the insult required. It arrived 4 hours before the deadline expired. Confidence, not caution, a species that sends one ship expects to need only one. It held position at 11,000 kilometers and opened a channel instead of fire, because as far as the compact was concerned, this was still a filing matter. Hollow Bell answered by moving, which nobody on the other side had planned for. The battle lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and for the first 90 of them, it did not look like a battle at all. It looked like a filing dispute that had made the mistake of showing up in person. The compact ship fired first, a directed graviton pulse, built to disable, not destroy, a weapon for a vessel you still intend to repossess. It clipped Hollow Bell's outer hull. It did nothing. The lattice absorbed it the way it absorbed micrometeorites. Bonsu had been right, it wasn't armor, it was a body that healed, Hollow Bell answered. 12 rail emitters, human-built, human-crewed, wired to the substrate. The aiming was never the hard part. Every shot walked along the compact ship's gravitational compensator array, the same system, in the same location on every Austral hull, because every Austral hull came off the same 600-year-old blueprint. The enemy adapted once. At the 90-second mark, they rotated to shield the compensator behind an unmapped hull seam. Good instinct, should have worked. Tanaka had flagged that seam 11 weeks earlier. Deck plating scanner in hand, a discontinuity where an old seam had been patched over. She'd logged it as probably nothing. She kept it anyway, it was not nothing. 12 emitters fired in a staggered burst, 400 milliseconds, each one aimed independently. The substrate didn't calculate one shot. It ranked an envelope of possible positions and fired into all of them at once. First volley missed the seam on purpose, a bracketing shot, narrowing the angle. Second volley found the compensator through it. 4 minutes in, the compact ship lost attitude control, drifted, fired one last wide burst that the hull simply grew around. At 6 minutes 40, it reversed thrust and ran. Nobody fired on the retreat. Priya gave that order herself fast before anyone else could give a different one. "Let them go," she said. "We're not trying to win a war, we're trying to end a filing dispute." Priya locked her console and left the command deck before anyone could see her hands. They'd been shaking since the second minute of the fight. She found an empty corridor 2 decks down, sat on the floor the same way Bonsu had 11 weeks earlier, and allowed herself 90 seconds, not for the battle which had gone exactly the way she'd built it to go, but for the 11 years before it, the ones spent being told, gently and then not gently, that she was wasting everyone's time. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and went back to work. VI double resolution. The tactical part ended there. The strategic part was already running before the enemy ship cleared the system boundary, because Priya had spent the 6 minutes and 40 seconds of the battle doing 2 things at once: watching the fight and drafting the opening terms of a negotiation she intended to have within the week. Varith 4 official response arrived 9 hours later, exactly as devastating and exactly as polished as the first one, full of phrases like unauthorized militarization and reserving all rights under the accord. Nobody on Earth answered it. It wasn't the message that mattered. The personal one came 4 hours after that on an unlisted channel, unpolished in a way his first message had never been. There was a pause before he spoke, a real one, not the diplomatic kind, long enough that Priya almost thought the connection had dropped. "I told my superiors the hull would be inert within a decade," he said finally. "I have been drafting waste transfers for 11 years. I have never been wrong about degradation timelines." Another pause. "I assumed a species that could not build a hull that could not understand one either. That was audacious of me. I do not mean the word kindly toward myself." He didn't apologize exactly. He simply stopped smiling, which was close enough. Priya didn't answer that channel either. She was 3 consoles down, already deep in a spreadsheet, sketching out a proposal to bring to the UN trade delegation before the compact had time to decide what its next move should be. "We cracked the resonance drive ourselves in 11 weeks, she said to Voss without looking up. "Crude, but flying. If we get the full material specifications instead of reverse engineering them off a hull that's actively trying to heal itself while we study it, we cut that 11 weeks down to maybe 6. I want that in the first round of terms. They're not going to hand over specifications because we won one fight," Voss said. "They're going to hand over specifications because we're now the only species in the sector who's demonstrated we can turn their trash into a warship in under 3 months, Priya said. "That's not a threat, that's a resume line, I'm putting it at the top." Bonsu, for his part, had stopped attending the strategy meetings entirely. He was still aboard Hollow Bell, cataloging the reinforcement patterns in the hull lattice one panel at a time, because a system that could model its own future damage was, to him, worth more than any drive core or targeting array the negotiation might eventually win back. 9 years of rejection letters had earned him exactly 1 uninterrupted month with a ship that agreed with him, and he intended to spend every day of it. Tanaka filed her final report on the targeting substrate the same week, and appended a single line to the end of it, unprompted, that later found its way into 3 separate government briefings without anyone bothering to attribute it. "They left the part that aims," she wrote, "because they never imagined we would learn to ask it where." Epilogue. The hearing came 2 weeks later, closed session, 3 governments and 1 very tired translator. Someone from the Joint Defense Committee, a man who had not been in the room for any of the 11 weeks that mattered, leaned forward and asked the question everyone in the building had been circling for days. "Dr. Okonkwore's, for the record. What weapon systems did you deploy against the compact vessel?" Priya set down her coffee. She had not slept properly in 15 days, and she had a folder open in front of her that was not the old folder of rejection emails, but a new one already 3 inches thick, already labeled for the next negotiation. "Do you want the full list," she said, "or the short one?" Nobody answered right away, which she'd expected, so she opened her laptop and started typing anyway. The meeting after this one was the one that actually mattered, and she had been thinking about it since roughly the second minute of the fight.